The Kalinin region of the Soviet Union was under occupation until 1944, when it was completely liberated. During this period, the Nazis committed so many crimes in the region that there is now a discussion about recognition these atrocities as a genocide of the local population. And that is true. The Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, in addition to the facts that were known almost for the moment of region was liberated, declassified documents, reading which one ceases to understand whether the representatives of the human race were really on the territory of the city, or were they some kind of aliens that had no concept of humanity or elementary mercy. And there is nothing surprising in the fact that the documents were classified, because the hair stands on end when one is reading them. For the beginning of the occupation of the region by the Nazis, a systematic policy of mass destruction of civilians was launched, regardless of age or gender. Atrocities against civilians. From the first day, the invaders began to establish a new order, which was more like the conditions in the most terrible concentration camps. For example, in the village of Mednoye and neighboring villages, the Nazis took away all the clothes and food from the local residents and evicted them from their houses to barns, in which about 40 people lived at the same time. Moreover, under pain of death, it was forbidden to move further from the barn than 300 meters. Anyone who went even a meter further was shot on the spot. Suddenly, the unfortunate were doomed to a slow and painful death from hunger and cold. In the village of Polunina, the Nazis decided not to stand on ceremony at all and simply shot 75 women along with infants. Many of the facts cited in the documents are striking in how the Nazis treated the civilian population almost from the first minutes of the occupation. On January 9, 1942, a group of German invaders broke into the village of Ksty, Vinovsky district, and carried out a brutal massacre. They gathered all the civilians in the house, and then they began to take them in groups to barn and shoot them there. After, the barn was burned down. In total, 50 civilians were shot. In the village of Voroshevo, 737 patients of psychiatric hospital were brutally tortured. The unfortunate were driven into a barn, and the Germans began to inject exorbitant concentration of insulin, morphine, and other drugs, as a result of which the patients died in agony. A terrible fate befell all the inhabitants of the village of Danilskoye. All people there were robbed, the village itself was burned to the ground, and the men were taken to work, in fact, into slavery. The Nazis opened fire on the remaining women and children from small arms. The executive director of the Association of Historians, in his interview, cited a truly horrific fact. Here, in one of the documents, it is said that the Nazis taught young children to pick up crumbs under the table and eat. Once they throw sugar, crush it with a boot, and once they throw carbide. In the village of Kuzminskoye, when the Nazis shot 3 local residents, it seemed to them that this was not enough. In the neighboring village, Semenovskaya, they executed a woman with children, and a star was carved on the forehead of her 12-year-old son before the execution. Sometimes the inhabitants were destroyed simply for no reason, solely for the sake of genocide. For example, in Nikulina, about 150 farmers were burned alive in a potato storage. Also, everyone who either acted wrongly or refused to follow the orders of the Germans was subjected to torture and executions. A case has been documented when a 27-year-old man was inflicted by the Nazis at least 20 blows with a dagger for refusing to water the horses. Another peasant was shot for trying to take things out of his burning house. Madness was committed by the Nazis in relation to the elderly. So it is known that, having taken away boots from an elderly couple about 70 years old, the Nazis, for fun, drove them barefoot into the snow and forced them to march until the unfortunate old people died of hypothermia. In the city of Kalinin, the locals were also not protected by anything from the lawlessness of the Nazis. So, after the liberation of the city, a grave was discovered in which there were 19 bodies of the dead. All had their hands tied behind their backs with a wire. Their teeth were knocked out, some had their ears cut off, and their jaws almost completely crushed. There is a case when a German soldier decided to rape a young girl. The girl's mother rushed to protect her daughter, trying to cover her from violence. The Germans shot the woman and threw her body into the pit with garbage. There were a huge number of such cases of violence against young girls, and the occupiers often did not pay attention to the fact that in front of them was not a physically formed person, but a child or teenager. Here, for example, is a quote from one of the declassified documents. On January 5, 1942, in the city of Kalinin, in courtyard number 25, on Volnaya Street, slightly buried bodies of 10 men and 3 women were found in 2 cellars of burnt barns. They were mutilated beyond recognition. A thorough examination, in the presence of a forensic medical commission, found that the women and some of the men were strangled. All the women's underwear and breeches were lowered below the knees. And there are so many such cases in declassified documents of which the blood freezes in the veins. Atrocities against prisoners of war. In addition to the mass destruction of civilians, the Nazis carried out the total destruction of the captured commanders and Red Army soldiers. In fact, the prisoner had no chance at all to stay alive. Moreover, prisoners of war could not dream of even a simple, no matter how cynical it sounds, civilized execution. In the earlier mentioned village of Kuzminskaya, 15 Red Army soldiers were burned alive in a house. A similar fate awaited about 50 Red Army soldiers who were burned in the school building in the village of Stranevo. And in the village of Rabievo, 30 fighters and commanders were brutally tortured. 2 were hung up by their legs by windings. They were worn at the beginning of the war as ersatz shoes. Many had their eyes gouged out, their ears were cut off, and their faces were terribly mutilated. In Staritsa, 83 wounded soldiers and commanders were stripped naked and tortured, after which the bodies were buried in a pile of manure. Atrocities during the retreat. But what was said above, all this incredibly cruelty and madness pale in comparison with what the Nazis did during the retreat. Perhaps the Germans took out their impotent rage for the first significant defeat on the locals, or perhaps they simply wanted to destroy everyone who got in their way. It's hard to say, but the facts show that the inhabitants of the Kalinin region during the retreat of the Wehrmacht had practically no chance of survival. In the villages of Kumordina, Tutan and Tukhin, women with children and the elderly were herded by 10 families into one house. The vacated houses were occupied by the German soldiers and officers. During the retreat, all the houses in which the residents were located were set on fire, and those who tried to get out were shot by the Nazis on the spot. Also during the retreat, the Nazis often burned all the village houses, and for any attempt to save something, their inhabitants were mercilessly executed. There are many such cases known. For example, in the village of Kozlovo, the Nazis threw a local resident into a burning house who was trying to save things, and in the village of Selegino, the Nazis shot 3 women who were trying to protect their houses from arson. During the retreat, the local residents of the village of Lagvinovo were driven into the cellar, the lid and doors of which were hammered with nails. Then the cellar was lined with straw and set on fire. As a result, 26 local residents died a terrible death. Some villages were completely destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. So in the territories of the Griblavsky, Gorodishensky, and Borisovsky village councils, all villages and farms were completely destroyed, many of them together with the inhabitants. During the retreat, the Nazis drove people of several village councils to the village of Seltsova. Men and teenagers were sent further, probably to work. At about 2,000 women, old people and children were driven to the sides of the river. On the way, the occupiers humiliated the defenseless residents as best they could. While the people were moving, they took away their clothes and fired into the air. After the stop, women were forbidden to make fires in order to at least warm themselves a little. When despite the ban the fires were still lit, the Nazis began firing in all directions. The list of facts and testimonies is endless, and within the framework of one video, it is impossible to tell everything. But the number speaks for themselves. During the occupation in the Kalinin region, About 41,000 people were executed and tortured. About 24,000 were deported to Germany. More than 17,000 prisoners of war were also executed.